All right, guys, we are back in my garage for another video. And I know a lot of things on the internet get blown out of proportion. People sensationalize things to try to get clicks and views. And I try not to do that. Genuinely, I want to give you guys honest feedback on my experience and things that I've seen as I'm helping other people with similar platforms. And a lot of the stuff I talk about, like talking about B58 common issues, always have people in the comments saying it's not that big a deal, saying stuff just for clicks or whatever, but it is genuinely stuff, again, that I've experienced or things that I've worked through with other people. And a big one was when I talked about oxygen sensors. I know this was a long time ago, and a lot of people told me that this wasn't really a B58 problem, and everything that I was sharing in the video was based on things that I had done through helping other people figure out problems with their cars. So I was just trying to share with you a perspective based on, working through those problems. But now, years later, I think I can honestly say that after working through 3 sets of O2 sensor replacements on my 440, and now working on my second set of O2 sensor replacements on my 340, that this is definitely a common B58 issue. And I know somebody out there is just gonna say, I'm doing it wrong, this doesn't make sense, but I at least wanna make this video to share with you my personal experience on what went wrong, how I figured out what the problem was, and of course, how I fixed it. So hopefully if you guys run into any of these problems, this will make it a lot less frustrating for you to get your car back on the road. So let's go ahead and hop over and replace this O2 sensor, and we will talk about it. Now, as always, for everybody that's new to the channel, I create these videos to help keep you updated on the latest developments in our community, as well as discuss technical topics so that we have a better understanding of how our engines work. So if you're interested in more videos like that, be sure to subscribe because there will be a lot more coming out in the future. Now, for anybody that's new to the channel, I do want to highlight that my 440 does have a top mount turbo, and just by design, this is a lot harder on O2 sensors, and it's a part of the reason why I've gone through so many on this car. So we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go into the video. Ignore the mess. I'm working on some other stuff in the background, but my 340 is a relatively stock style setup. It does have a dynamic AutoWorks hybrid turbo that you can see is nicely turning purple under there, so I've been working it pretty hard. But the O2 sensors are mounted in the factory location with a catless downpipe, so nothing really too crazy. I wouldn't expect this to be a huge issue, yet I am still going through some O2 sensor issues. So we'll talk about it a little bit more as I replace these, but I've moved some stuff out of the way. You can see it's nice and easy to access. You just need a 7/8 wrench, and we'll be able to remove those without even jacking up the car. So let's go ahead and talk about it. All right, so hopefully you guys are hearing me clearly. I am dealing with the heat wave that I think most of us are dealing with this summer, but I do have the fan running just so I don't pass out in here. So I apologize if that messes up the audio a little bit, but let's go ahead and remove this O2 sensor. So first I want to talk about how an O2 sensor works. And this is something I've talked about a couple months ago, I think. And the concept is pretty simple. It's an AFR sensor. AFR stands for air fuel ratio. And that means that it is measuring the mix of air and fuel inside of your exhaust gases. And really it's an oxygen sensor, so it's measuring the oxygen contact in your exhaust gases. Now this does require being heated up to a certain temperature in order for it to work, so that's why it should be mounted as close to the engine as possible in most cases, so it heats up quickly and can give you accurate readings, because without it being hot enough, it won't be able to give you an accurate O2 sensor reading. So that's something that is critical to the functionality. But once it is warm enough, the car starts using those readings to calculate how much fuel should be injected, and it makes minor adjustments while you're driving to get it on target. So the target does change a little bit if it's as efficient as possible. It basically has a nice clean burn, gets you good gas efficiency and stuff like that. If it gets too lean, then it can run really hot and potentially damage your engine, so that's no good. If it's too rich, then you get poor fuel economy. Sometimes it can stumble and misfire, so you don't necessarily want it too rich either. You basically want it to be right in the optimal power band depending on your driving style. So that's going to vary if you're idling or cruising versus going full throttle and driving in full boost. A lot of modern BMWs run at Lambda 1 or 14.7 AFR in most scenarios, even when you're going full throttle, which is something that throws a lot of us off. But if you have a tune like I do, then it typically targets a richer AFR to keep things safe as you push higher boost levels and basically push your engine a lot harder. Yeah, this could be our issue. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Now, there are a lot of different ways that an O2 sensor can fail, and a big part of it is that the internals are pretty fragile, so you want to try not to bang them around a lot when you're installing them and stuff like that. But it looks like, you know, a big hard metal sensor, when in reality the internals can be damaged pretty easily. So if you drop it or, you know, just have like improper handling, then that can cause them to break. But also there are additional functionalities like the heating element that makes sure it's up to temperature as quickly as possible. If that fails, then the O2 sensor won't be able to get an accurate reading, which can of course cause issues. So it's important for the heater to work. It's important for the wiring to be sending an accurate signal so that it can actually heat up the O2 sensor. Of course, having really hot exhaust gases help. So if you have your O2 sensor in poor placement, that can cause it not to work properly and things like that. So just a lot of stuff in the O2 sensor itself can fail. Also, it can have wiring issues, which again, because it's in the exhaust path, it gets very hot and everything coming off of it needs to be protected. So a lot of times you'll see O2 sensors have a nice amount of heat shielding on it to protect it, because you want the internals to get hot so that it can get an accurate reading, but you don't want the wiring and everything else to get too hot to the point where it can melt. So there's like a delicate balance there to get optimal functionality. But with all of this stuff that you see on here where, you know, it's protecting some of the elements and the wiring is covered and stuff, this is all to make sure that the wiring stays good while the actual sensor itself can get hot and give you an accurate AFR reading. And then another thing is just moisture, which I think this can happen mostly from doing a lot of short drives. I do short drives with the 340 sometimes because this is more of a daily driver for me. So sometimes I do quick trips to, you know, the grocery store or the post office or whatever. I don't really do that with the 440 as much. That's more of like typically going on longer distance drives if I'm driving to work or going to a car show or whatever. So it's not as big of a risk on that car. But on this car, I can definitely say I think that's a factor because of how that O2 sensor looked when I came out and saw it. Of course, the last time I drove it, I was having an issue, so I stopped driving the car pretty quickly. But the longer you drive the car to burn off all the moisture and everything that could get on the O2 sensors and damage it, it's a better idea. Now, that's a bigger concern on top mount turbos because depending on the angle of your O2 sensor, it's more susceptible to having moisture pool up on it, especially when you're doing a cold start. So when the engine isn't hot enough to burn off all that moisture and water pools up and doesn't get properly, you know, drained out of the oxygen sensor, it can cause the O2 sensor to go bad. So like I said, I've gone through 3 sets of O2 sensors on my 440. All of those have happened since going with the top mount turbo back in 2021. So 3 sets of sensors in 4 years. Granted, the most recent one was about 2 months ago, and that's when I first started considering making this video, but I hadn't gotten around to it. And now that I'm doing it on the 340 again, of course, I decided we need to talk. But because of the angle of the O2 sensor being almost horizontal, you know, the way that the downpipe basically points straight down, your O2 sensors come in straight from the side, and that creates a bigger likelihood of water collecting in the O2 sensor and causing it to foul out. Really, you want your O2 sensor at least at a 10-degree angle, but the closer to vertical, the better. So if any moisture collects in it, it can drain back out and go out through the exhaust. So if it's horizontal or below horizontal, water can pull up and basically sit inside the O2 sensor and damage those internals. So just kind of something to keep in mind for anybody else that's going with a top mount. Your O2 sensors are probably not going to last very long. Now, since we're on the topic, there are a lot of other things that can cause issues as well. A big one is misfires, which is what most people report when they end up having O2 sensor problems. Either full throttle or at idle, the car is misfiring and stumbling, and that's actually a part of what I run into. A big one on the 440 is it will misfire when it's cold, but usually once it warms up, the misfires will go away. And I've gotten to the point now where if that starts happening, I know immediately that it is another O2 sensor that failed, because it's almost always the same thing. And so that is pretty frustrating, but it's even more dangerous if it happens during a pull or something like that. You know, partial load driving and driving around town is an issue, but it's not as catastrophic as if it happens in full boost. So there are a couple things that you can look for if you are experiencing misfires, just to make sure it's an O2 sensor versus, you know, chasing your tail with fuel pumps and stuff like that. So what I recommend is looking at your lambda readings. Look at lambda target and lambda actual, and your AFRs should be a relatively smooth line, whether you're on a custom tune or an off-the-shelf map. If you see any spikes where it suddenly goes to full rich or full lean, and you see your fuel trim spike and suddenly go to like plus or minus 30%, that's going to cause your fuel system to max out. You'll run out of fuel, basically the same as a high pressure fuel pump crashing, and it will misfire. But that's not a high pressure fuel pump going bad. That's your O2 sensor freaking out the car and making it think you're either running super lean or super rich, and the car is trying to compensate. So that's something to pay attention to. I know a lot of people tell me they think their fuel pump's going bad because they see rail pressure dips, but if you look a little more closely, you can see it's actually related to fuel trims spiking and creating a scenario where the car is trying to overcompensate. So your fuel system could be well within its capability to support the torque and boost that you're requesting, but a bad O2 sensor is making it, you know, overwork beyond its capability. Another thing I see a lot is smoke, and it looks not quite like a PCV failure. Like a PCV failure will typically have really thick smoke, but when my O2 sensor fails, it's almost like smoke is just slowly seeping out of the exhaust, and it's kind of bizarre looking because it's not like the engine is blown, but it's still way more smoke than I would be comfortable with, and I'm sure any of you would be comfortable with as well. And so that's kind of what I experienced on the 440 as well as the 340. And this was at low load scenarios. It was stumbling a little bit, but just seeing the smoke coming out of the exhaust made me want to investigate a little more. So I looked at my lambda readings, and they were stuck at 14.7, and my short-term fuel trims were stuck at 0.01, and it was just sitting there with absolutely no adjustment. And I got some feedback from Jordan at Arcade Tunes, Doug at Subpar Tuning, Steven at Wedge Performance, a bunch of tuners that I was talking to about this, and they all experienced the same thing when there's an O2 sensor failure. Typically, the lambda will just get stuck at 1, which is 14.7 AFR in our logs, and the short-term fuel trims won't adjust anything. It's like the car thinks that everything's perfect, which either ends up running slightly rich or slightly lean and creates the smoke that you see. So in my case, I'm assuming it was rich because I could smell the fuel, and you know, it was smoking, not quite like a diesel truck, but smoke coming out of the exhaust. On my 440 one time, it was like misfiring and stumbling, and when I looked in my rear window, I saw the smoke coming out of the car. So stuff like that freaks you out. It makes you think that potentially your engine is blown or something, but it's not quite that typical like thick billowy smoke that you would associate with a blown engine or a blown turbo. It's just like almost like smoke coming from fire that just got put out. You know, it's kind of bizarre looking, but that again was an instant indicator that it's probably my O2 sensor that failed. So like most things, I don't recommend guessing. I don't recommend asking a friend. I recommend starting with running a log. That's the easiest way to really see at least what is going on, and you can look at the full picture to tell yourself what your misfires are for. Because again, misfires can be caused by anything: spark plugs, coil packs, anything that affects ignition, air, or fuel can cause your car to misfire. So it's really critical that you do your due diligence to see the full picture of what the problem is to properly diagnose and fix it instead of potentially just putting band-aids on it. And just a reminder, all you need to do is log the scenario where you're having your issue. So if it's a rough idle, log idle. If it's misfires at full throttle, it sounds crazy, but you're gonna have to log full throttle. Hopefully you were logging at the time when the misfire occurred. But these are the things that are actually going to give you the answers to understand exactly what's going wrong. Otherwise, you won't have the full picture and you can't really make an educated decision without all of that data. Also, it's a good idea just to visually inspect the wiring. I think that that is a pretty common issue, especially if you're like me and the actual mounts on top of the valve cover broke. So your O2 sensor is dangling over here a little bit. It can definitely get damaged and melt. I actually had the issue with this car when I got it from Copart. Those of you remember, I bought this car from a junkyard as a project, and they thought the engine was blown because it was smoking so bad. A part of that issue was the O2 sensor, and replacing it helped fix that. But the actual connector was like all bubbled up and stuff. So I'm sure it was getting bad readings partially due to that. So just keep an eye on it. You don't want it to get to the point where it's, you know, creating an issue. And if you start seeing it melt or wires getting, you know, glued together or the sheathing is coming off, it's a good idea just to go ahead and get that replaced before it becomes a bigger problem. And then a worst case scenario is it's something in the engine harness, which I have seen that before. The wiring does run all the way along the front of the engine back to the DME. So if there are any breaks, damage, you know, even potentially a bad DME can cause O2 issues. But as you can see, the O2 sensor is so easy to access, so easy to replace. And if you buy these parts from FCP Euro, you get their lifetime warranty. So every time these fail, I take the old ones, put them back in the box. These are actually Bosch, by the way. These aren't OEM. The Bosch units are the OEM supplier. So I just buy the Bosch version. But yeah, you can buy it from FCP Euro and get it replaced for free, and even just have a backup in the garage in case the worst were to happen in the future. But yeah, that's where I start. It's relatively simple. It takes about maybe an hour max to actually get access to it, especially if you've got heat shield and, you know, catch can and all this stuff in the way. But otherwise, really simple and easy to replace, even on my top mount, because everything is right there. So yeah, hopefully this helps you guys out and explains a little bit more about the oxygen sensor issue that I talked about last year and gives you a little more perspective on my experience. Again, if you have a top mount turbo, this is going to be a much more common issue, unfortunately. So because of that, I just keep extra ones on hand, just because with my luck, I go through them every literally like 18 to 24 months. It's just kind of a part of my ongoing maintenance with this car. But thankfully, again, through FCP Euro, replacements are virtually free, and it only takes about an hour of my time to get this back going. So again, just something to keep an eye on. Hopefully this gives you awareness in case you do run into this problem, so it isn't as frustrating as it was for me the first time I had this issue. There we go. Crisis averted. But yeah, just wanted to give you guys a heads up. This isn't, you know, to start some freaking out of everybody, but it is something that is relatively common, relatively confusing to diagnose because it's not as common on other cars and not a lot of people are familiar with how they fail. But thankfully something we can get ahead of with a little bit of awareness. So let me know your experience. Let me know if you've gone through O2 sensors. Let me know if I'm a complete idiot and this is obviously user error and something that I'm doing wrong. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts, but otherwise that is it for this video. So thank you guys for watching, and I hope this helps. And if you have any other questions or comments, leave them down below.